Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Is Your Responsive Design Responsive Enough? Let's start off with brief introductions. First, I'd like to introduce James Zetlin. James is my counterpart for today's webinar. He is a software architect at Mozu, based out of Austin, Texas. James is a definition of a front-end guy. So from JavaScript and framework code to CSS and HTML, .NET to classic ASP, James is going to be our technical lead in today's webinar. My name is Dane Downer. I am the co-founder of Brand Labs. We are a digital agency located just outside of Detroit, Michigan, where we solely focus on building and marketing e-commerce sites. So James and I are super excited to talk to you about responsive development and other development techniques and methodologies. We're not here to take a hard stance or to sing the praises of any one technique, but rather to encourage you to stay open to the multiple schools of thought or approaches that do exist to properly develop for the multi-device world that we live in. So if everyone is ready, James is going to get this responsive party started by taking us back to the year 335 BC. James?
Thank you, Dane, and thanks for that winning introduction. I hope to live up to it, but I feel like you built me up a lot, so now I'm going to have to sound extra proud. Hi, folks. This is, as Dane said, about how to situate concepts like responsive design in the overall philosophy that you use when you are approaching a web project. And so in keeping with that term philosophy, we thought we would try to relate this to the outside world of philosophy, as you can perhaps see from this slide. So we're going to talk about Plato, who is not really a deep cut. You've probably heard of him, and he is what some folks consider to be kind of the forefather of all philosophy in the Western world. He influences human thought, kind of not just in academics, but in our everyday intuitions, really. And even if you don't think about him every day, there's something about being the foundation of a civilization where he kind of works his way in there. So here's where he's relevant to what we're talking about. Plato was interested in ideal forms, called Platonic forms. Maybe you've heard of them. And he felt that the things that you did philosophy and the things that you reason about were the ideal immaterial concepts which existed on a plane that we cannot access. And all of the physical things in the world were only important and only significant insofar as they resembled those ideal things. So a box or a crate was important not because of its physical characteristics, but because it resembles the form of the cube, the form of the square. And what that resulted in, once you filter that down into sort of making conclusions about the world, was that he felt that if you could come up with the simplest possible definition for something, then that was the closest to the real truth about that thing. So Plato and his students at his school called the Academy, first one, they once, in a famous story that is likely to be entirely true in every detail, came up with a definition for human being called featherless bipeds. I figured that was all you really need to get to featherless biped. So Diogenes, in response, who was mostly famous for being aggressive and homeless and thinking everyone was a liar, went and got a plucked chicken and threw it over the wall of the Academy. "This is your human," he said. So apart from being a cool story about everyday life in ancient Greece, this also, I think, illustrates that even a really powerful principle, one that forms the foundation for a lot of thought, one size can fit all, ideals are important, it doesn't apply in every case. And there are cases where it can be humblingly insufficient for the thing you're trying to figure out. And that's something that we're kind of doing today. I think sort of in the world of web technology, when we try to apply the concept of responsive design, responsive development to every single project, when we try to think of it as a universal and totalizing principle, then I think we run into similar problems. And every once in a while, we might deserve to get a plucked chicken to the face. And I think we've all experienced pluck chicken to the face moments. Those of you who are on this call who have done responsive development before, you know that there's certain types of problems that can arise, right? Like, for instance, responsive is not really just media queries, not really just browser scaling of images. It really began its life as an abstract concept promoted by Ethan Marcotte. And about 5 years ago, the article that he wrote on The List Apart emphasized that responsive development is really about responding to users' needs. Famously, he related it to trends in architecture, where modern architects were trying to use materials and designs that would make their buildings actually change and respond to the density of their inhabitants, or the behavior of their population. And so in an abstract and broad sense, that's kind of what responsive is about. But I think we all know that on the ground, we're doing projects. Responsive can mean something a little different. To the sales cycle and to the folks who are doing discovery, I think responsive can be used as a byword to just mean there's a mobile story of some kind. It works on mobile. There's a mobile site as well. And so responsive is a word that gets used and even built into statements of work and into contractual obligations that you're going to make the site responsive in this way. We run into trouble because in the same way that responsive gets distilled to mean just mobile at that stage, and for those folks, we developers also have a sort of inaccurate and reductive concept of what responsive development means. When we say, it just means you write a bunch of media queries, everything has to be the same style sheet. You use fluid grid layouts. You do browser image scaling if you can. You use features of modern browsers that show and hide content in general, kind of based on the viewport and based on the size and the sort of abstract characteristics of the device that they're going to be displayed on. But in order for those techniques to be effective, in order for them to be the right choice for the job, the project needs to have a specific style. It needs to come from that abstract kind of belief that this thing needs to respond to its users. This thing needs to be an ideal form that is aware of and flexible and fluid according to the needs of its users at runtime. And your project might not be suited to those development techniques. And the way that you know is if you use all of the responsive development techniques that your development team knows about. We write a bunch of media queries. We find over and over again that the vision for the mobile site differs a little bit, so you write another rule inside your media query. You end up with essentially 2 or more style sheets all jammed into a single front-end asset. You end up with a lot of different images. You end up with scaling that forces an image with a really large file size to display at a really small resolution. And you end up with these little performance costs adding up to a site that, in our delightful little image there, has become unresponsive. So a lot of the time I think folks conclude we did it wrong, this wasn't good enough, or the client requirements just were too large. The truth is your project might not be suited to responsive development techniques. And we should stop viewing that as a fallback or a compromise or a capitulation to go with a different set of technologies. That's the thing that we're trying to get across here. Responsive is a very important concept, a really beautiful one. And rather than saying, there's problems with it in general, there are problems with the way that it is applied in the marketplace. So, Dane, I think you, at the level that you operate, at the vision level and at the direction level, have experienced this sort of one-size-fits-all mentality. I certainly have the development side. So why don't you take it and talk about what that means in the larger world?
Well, before we move on to the next slide, I think I'd love to just take a moment to have everybody think about the answers to a couple questions. So first, what percentage of users do you think will abandon the site that takes longer than 4 seconds to load? Your choices are 10% of users, 25% of users, or 50% of users will abandon a site that takes longer than 4 seconds to load. And the second question, how many people in the world do you think have average internet speed slower than 4 megabits per second? Is it 1.5 billion, 2.5 billion, or 3.5 billion people that have slower internet speeds? Answer to these questions: 25% of users abandon a site that takes longer than 4 seconds to load. So 25%. If you were to build a poorly functioning, slow to load site, you are pushing away 25% of your audience potentially in an instant. Our point here is that the stakes are high. They're very high. 3.5 billion people are on slower internet connections. So wait times around the world are a huge factor, and really just not to be taken lightly when thinking about a project and the best way to approach development.
Exactly. And I think that we've kind of collected these statistics to show you the significance of small amounts of load time. Because certainly in my field, I've noticed that an emerging consensus, can happen in a field where there's been a lot of speed gains recently. For folks like me who write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or things that compile there too, it's been kind of tremendous in the past 10 years. With the advent of V8 and a lot of strong JIT techniques, websites perform so incredibly fast that a lot of the time developers will tell each other it's time to stop prioritizing performance. It's true that there is often a trade-off with performance. It's almost invariable that if you design strictly for performance techniques and develop that way, that the trade-off will be in readability, maintainability, and understandability. So that is a legitimate decision that you can make. But I think sometimes we've gone too far. And even if the performance optimizations that you can make aren't going to double or triple or do something crazy to the payload of your site, I think that this should show you that in the large sense of the world of emerging markets and emerging people and people who are served primarily by mobile networks, that small performance optimizations can have a tremendous impact. And we ran a case study where we took a Mozu asset that had been developed using traditional responsive orthodoxy techniques. And we implemented a family of techniques that we're calling predictive, which we'll get to in a minute. And our case study showed that we got up to 50% improvement in load times and in asset size. And though some of those assets are fairly small, again, that can make a big difference. So we have to think about what type of user we're addressing, what type of demographic our site or our project is going to go to when we choose how much to prioritize performance optimization. And furthermore, with the advent of a bunch of different new tooling systems and new sort of developer-side techniques with front-end development, we can do a lot of performance engineering and performance optimization without the trade-offs or all of the trade-offs that we experienced in the past. The important thing is to understand how to prioritize that, and that involves kind of starting out in the initial discovery phase of your project without saying that responsive design or development is just part of the turnkey solution, without considering it to be mandatory in order to stay current. Instead, you've got to go with a different approach. And Dane and I have kind of tried to figure out what we can do to crystallize this in everyone's head. And so we've got some terminology that we want to share with you. Dane?
Thanks, James. So site slowness factors, like we were talking about in the previous slide, are just one of many considerations. But it's a great example because you start to see just how important the development technique of choice is and how heavily it weighs on the eventual success or failure of your project. So how do you make sure that your approach is the right approach? Well, first, getting buy-in from all parties involved on adopting a purpose-driven web philosophy. So it all starts with sitting down with the project stakeholders and really defining the primary purpose, goals, and objectives of the site. Oftentimes, if you're working with a client, you ask the client for their goals, and often the response is responsive web design. Many folks think that the end game is responsive. Well, responsive is a technique, and you employ that technique to meet the goals. It's not the goal itself. So consider a truly great site, one that's easy to use across all devices. These sites are simple and intuitive, and they deliver a great user experience. But building a site with a great user experience is complex, and it takes a ton of forethought. So very early on, these sites have made super tough decisions, all centered around the understanding of what the primary purpose and the goals of the site. Every part of the site is then weighed against those goals and that purpose. So by maintaining this dedication to your site's purpose, you can choose a development technique that will allow you to provide a best fit experience to the end user. So clarify and understand your project's purpose, and we believe that you and your team will almost naturally be led to the best tool set to do the job right.
And in that tool set, responsive is only one of a number of different options. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you, and certainly me during the sort of the genesis of this presentation, are thinking that responsive doesn't belong alongside a bunch of other tools because, as we discussed early on, responsive is really a philosophy. And I think that it's important here to distinguish between responsive design and responsive development. Now, whether or not you agree with my sort of passing definition here, which I'm not trying to make rigorous, I would say responsive design is what Ethan Marcotte was talking about. It's what the folks who discussed a mobile-first architecture and how that lends itself to responsive design, that's kind of what those folks are talking about. When folks, as Dana and I have both done, try to address responsive from beyond the confines of the development techniques and browser features we've talked about to say, well, should it not respond maybe to your location, or should it not respond to what we understand about our demographics or the time of day? That's really responsive design. You're thinking about the features of your project from the perspective of what's going on at the moment that your tool is in use. And that's great. But responsive development is a different thing. There is a small set of techniques which have become widely understood to be the things you use to get a site to respond to different viewports, to be reductive about it. And responsive development techniques, that is the use of CSS media queries, the use of feature detection in the browser, viewport measurement in the browser to determine JavaScript behaviors, the use of source set attributes or picture elements if you are targeting sort of edge browsers in order to deliver different images at runtime, and the use of fluid grid layouts with specific breakpoints to target pixel resolutions. Those are all things that we would kind of consider to be part of a toolbox that is missing some tools that you have perhaps unwittingly or wittingly deprecated when it came time to do responsive everywhere. And we should talk about them here just in brief. Up on the slide, we have progressive enhancement, which is something I think we're all familiar with. You want to start with a basic readable document. This is sort of from the philosophy of the web as a collection of documents. And you put together an experience that works for lower capability browsers, for spiders, for SEO friendliness, and for the sort of mobile user agents and just for slower connections. And then you do feature detection at runtime, or if you're super fancy, you do a little bit of bandwidth detection. And then you start applying enhancements. You upgrade certain bits of functionality. You layer new behaviors on top of it, progressively. And then sort of the natural sort of converse of that operation is called graceful degradation, where instead of starting with a very basic document, you really start with something large and interaction heavy, and then you provide a sort of a basic fallback. You write sort of a separate, simpler, restricted experience so that you can deliver that at runtime if you detect that certain features aren't present. There's another sort of large and general term called adaptive design and adaptive development. And some of you may have heard of this. I've certainly seen this bandied about for now many years. You might think that in some of the stuff you've read in your own work, you find adaptive design and adaptive development to address some of the concerns that we've brought up. And I wouldn't dispute you, but I would say that of those of you who are thinking that, each one of you probably has a different idea of what adaptive really means. I certainly have had several different ones over the course of doing research for this and over the course of my career. I think initially adaptive was probably defined just as rigorously as anything else, but what Dane and I have found is that the term adaptive design has really gotten very diffuse. There's a lot of different folks who think it means that you use responsive development techniques, but whereas true responsive is just a pure fluid grid, that adaptive techniques use specific breakpoints, which are known to be the resolutions of popular devices, and so it's a sort of halfsies approach. And then there's other folks who say, well, that's not it. Actually, adaptive is doing user agent detection in order to deliver different assets, which is something that we're going to talk about. So the trouble with adaptive, I think, is just that in a field where it's important that we communicate and understand our priorities and our needs early on in the discovery process, which is the main thrust of our talk, a term that is prone to mutual misunderstanding like adaptive might not be super useful. So we've come down to a sort of an unnamed set of tools that those of you who did web design prior to the halcyon days of responsive might recall. Making a separate mobile site, right? Or finishing up the desktop site just in time for your statement of work to be over for the due date, and then taking a deep breath and realizing that now you have to write the mobile style sheet. Now you have to write the mobile scripts. Now you have to do the mobile nav. Those are all things that we want to stop doing because responsive lets us write a single asset. User agent detection, figuring out from the user agent string that browsers send into the server what device a person is on, and then delivering a completely separate experience, maybe a separate style sheet, maybe an extra style sheet on top of the base one, maybe even different HTML. Doing detection of the viewport size and delivering a different resolution of image or a different compression ratio of image. These are all techniques that have been more or less deprecated because they violate the principle that a responsive site should embody an ideal visual system that gets determined at runtime. So the thing about it is when you make a responsive website that has several different kind of look and feels, several different UX experiences for different browsers and different devices, when you build that into a single ideal package, the way Plato, the web developer, would have done, you are effectively delegating a certain type of organizational task. Now, where once upon a time, we took our style sheets and we understood which part was for the mobile and which part was for the desktop, and then on our development machines or at the server side at runtime, we put them in separate little buckets. Now, we have media queries so that the browser does that. Well, that's great, but you are delegating that task to the computer in the hand of the person who's running on a sub-4 megabit mobile network. You are delegating the task of resizing images, which is a very CPU-heavy task, to devices across the world or devices in the hands of your demographic users who are at risk of abandoning your site if it takes 4 seconds to load. And I'm not saying that's a terrible choice or that media queries are a bad technology, because as these devices get faster, those things get less and less important. But nevertheless, it is something that you should be aware is a trade-off that you are making. So we have in the past, and we can continue to in the future, take these tasks, these organizational tasks of picking which part of the style sheet to use and to apply to the DOM, which images to render, all that stuff, which behaviors to apply. And we can choose to do that with other computers at compile time or at render time. And that collection of tools, that collection of disciplines, especially enhanced with a more modern build process that we used to have, is what we're calling predictive development. That's the term that we're using to describe things that you're probably already familiar with, but that you might not have a particular name for, and that ever since the advent of responsive, you're kind of not doing it anymore. So I think, Dane and I have both found that using responsive early on makes clients think a certain set of advantages, a certain set of top reasons. And Dane, in his experience, and me in mine, we might sort of share some stuff with you. I mean, Dane, what have you found early on? People at the discovery process, clients will say about these different techniques.
Well, I think it's mostly just saying that people don't understand the differences of them. And really, at the beginning of a project, there needs to be a discovery just to make sure that you're speaking on the same level and everybody understands what the different approaches are and which are the best for the particular project that you're working on.
Totally. I mean, when you hear responsive, you often hear the mobile site is not going to take as much work. It's not going to be as developer unfriendly. It's going to take up less of the statement of work. There's going to be better SEO value. There's going to be a better user experience. Certainly going to be a lot easier to maintain. And, you know, everybody's doing it. Well, I think we can accomplish all of these things. We can accomplish them using sort of the same ease of use and the same sort of techniques that people are using to deploy responsive websites. So let's talk a little bit more about what predictiveness really is. First of all, we've already seen that when you try to force responsive development techniques on assets and on UX that wasn't originally designed with a single monolithic responsive experience in mind, it can result in a site sort of stuffed full of descriptive data and assets and style sheet language that the user's browser downloads but doesn't use. And when your mobile UI diverges significantly enough, you're kind of writing a second style sheet in media queries. So that's going to make a difference to load time. And so predictive development is about avoiding those poor performance impacts, even as minor as they are, because we understand that they can have that impact on your visibility to 3.5 billion people. And so if you are envisioning with horror the days of making a separate mobile website again, we can use modern systems to make this just as developer-friendly as responsive design. I think a lot of you guys, if you're front-end developers, have started using a compilation or build process in the stuff that you make. Maybe to minify the JavaScript, maybe to translate from a pre-processing language like Sass or Less into a large and organized CSS style sheet. Maybe some of you are using task runners to coordinate and put all of that operation into a single pipeline. Task runner like Grunt is a system written in Node.js that we have started to use for quite a lot of different internal Mozo operations. So what if you had a single directory of common assets, which include the parts of the site that will be consistent across your multiple user agents, like branding, like color schemes and colorways, like web fonts, like a certain set of iconography, and perhaps like a simple HTML base. And then you had separate directories on your development machine for the differences that the desktop site will impose on top of that common set of assets, and then a separate directory for the set of mobile assets. And then every time you saved a change, then the grunt process would watch your file system and then would make a separate asset for the desktop that consists of applying the diff of the desktop directory onto common and spitting that out into one folder or one file, and then doing the same thing with the mobile. Thus helping you to work on a single common set of assets and impose overrides minimally, but still produce two separate optimized assets for a very performance-conscious world. We have done stuff like that, and that's where we found those performance gains that we told you about in the previous slide, the infographic. There are dependency detecting asset builders like Require and Browserify and Webpack, which can walk a sort of a module tree, and you can write pragmas in there that will include different dependencies based on a different set of targeted platforms. And that's going to help you reduce even more payload, since JavaScript-friendly sites, since JavaScript apps have gotten so large and such a significant portion of what we have in our overall payload. So there are a lot more tools like this than there were before responsive design became the thing that everyone does. And so we can now produce a workflow that much more resembles the working on a single asset sort of thing. If you don't like the idea of having separate directories, what about this? You know, it comes time to make a breakpoint. Using the old responsive canard, the site started to look weird, so it's time to make a breakpoint. Well, you want to write that in a media query in your own style sheet, so why not write that media query in a style sheet and then use a CSS syntax preprocessor like the popular Node project Rework? What that'll do is take apart your CSS style sheet into a syntax tree, and then you can run your own transform on it and spit out other CSS files. Effectively, you can take that extra style sheet that you're stuffing into media queries and then automatically on save or on build, split it into a separate mobile style sheet that you can then add to the mobile client at runtime, subtracting the desktop stuff, the desktop rules that the mobile client doesn't use, and subtracting the inverse from the desktop side. So these are all things that seem like they impose an extra burden of complexity on you, the developer. And I understand that, and that's definitely something you have to overcome. We've had to work at it. But again, what you're doing is you're switching what you're delegating the task of organizing those assets to. Instead of forcing the mobile device, which has a small RAM overhead, small processor, and maybe working on a very poor network connection, instead of forcing it to do that organizational work for you, we're finding ways to do it at build time. And then there's also runtime solutions on the server side. We've heard people say that they use Adobe Scene 7 to do image processing at the last minute before delivery to great success, which reduces probably the largest single amount of payload for a modern responsive site, which is the size and pixel resolution of images. So these are all really important techniques, and yes, they do carry with them a certain development overhead early on. I think they can become part of your best practices portfolio. Of course, the trick is, as Dane is about to sort of elucidate to you, when to use them. When you begin a project, how do you kind of determine when this is going to require predictive development techniques because we need to do those performance enhancements? Or perhaps, how do you determine this is well suited to a responsive development approach where a single asset can serve multiple platforms? Dane?
Yes, I think it's important to say that James and I are not trashing responsive development techniques in any way. You know, there are many use cases that responsive development is the perfect technique. So we believe that sites heavy in content, long form writing, text heavy sites that are light on images and other weighty assets, those are a great fit for responsive. Sites that have interaction, but that interaction takes a back seat to the content. Sites that stick with basic grid systems and minimize complex spatial relationships are all good for responsive. These types of sites have a lower risk of becoming bloated. They're less likely to run into poor functionality headaches from trying to force functionality into a technique or method that was not built to accommodate it. So some examples would be like HuffingtonPost.com. They have short content but limited interactions. A site like Medium.com for their long content. It's a very sort of blog-centric, long-form written site. James, anything to add to those sites?
Those are the things that come to the top of my mind as well, certainly. Really, any blog-based site, you can sort of assume that anything where it's a content document, as the web was once described to mostly be, that's going to work really well in a responsive paradigm because those are already relationships that we're super familiar with. Another one is even if there are a lot of interactions, like Instagram, a great example, right? Which is just like any social network, primarily concerned with sort of people tagging up each other's photographs as well as presenting them with types of content relations like a like and a share and a comment. But Instagram, the key is that it started as an app. And its website is, I'm not going to call it an afterthought, but it's definitely an extension of the app experience. And there you go, a responsive development technique is perfect there because in that case, you're really writing a mobile experience first, quite literally, in the development cycle. And then you are, not quite, you are then applying media queries so that you can achieve a desktop look. So we have an example here. Look at Medium. We talked about this. When it's content, when it's long form, there are relationships there that we as people who went to school are already kind of familiar with. A like and a share and a comment, those are relationships that sometimes we need a little visual help to understand what they are. But look at this thing. This is a desktop site which displays a long-form piece of journalism. It's got a body text. It's got an image. It's got a little attribution on the image on the left, and it's got a little bit of header right there in the middle. And then over on the right, we have a piece of marginalia, something that is tangentially related to the main text. So you don't have to be an expert to understand what you're looking at is a piece of writing, and the relationships that these things have are not directly bound by space. The fact that that image is above that text doesn't mean anything special about how it's related to it. It's just related to it. And so when these relationships, notes and headers and images and captions, are relationships that we are already familiar with from the world outside the web, then it becomes really easy to implement the exact same relationships really clearly in a different form factor. And that's what we've done. Here, with Medium, well, that's what Medium has done anyway, you can still see that all the relationships are really similar. It's got the same attribution, it's just in a different spot. It's got the same header and body text, and the marginalia is gone, but that's because it wasn't super important anyway. So that's when responsive really works beautifully, is when you've got a mobile-first vision, or when you have relationships that are not specifically technical and don't need to be modeled in a very specific spatial way. So in contrast, when you do predictive design, when you know you have to implement a predictive site, it looks a little something like this. And we all know that the web is not documents anymore, right, Dan? We know it's not going to be long-form journalism to the end. There are a lot of sites that really, there are a lot of sites that really applications now, and that's what type of development a lot of us are doing. And what a web app really is it's an interface that has workflow rather than a document that has presentation layer. The interactions can be really complex, and sometimes they have to be modeled spatially. You know, take as an example of like a list builder, where you have a UI where there is a bunch of items in a list, and then you have to select a subset of them and put them into a new list. And we've all seen these UIs, right? I mean, we have the left panel or the right panel, and then a little switcheroo box in the middle, or we have a forest of checkboxes. And it's a large enough viewport that you can kind of get a quick glance at the overall state of your selections. Taking that UI and then trying to model that in mobile, we're not trying to say that it's impossible. We're trying to say that you have to do some UX on that. You can't just say, well, take the forest of checkboxes and then apply a simple CSS rule that says when the viewport is small enough, then they're in a stack. That stack of checkboxes may not all fit on your mobile device's screen, and so it may not be as usable as a UI. If you prioritize UX, which when you're building complex workflows you do need to do, then what you're doing is you are redoing UX for different viewports. You are reconsidering and then doing extra work on how your app works in different form factors and on different devices. I mean, there's even the input method to take into account. If you can't mouse over things, then the discoverability of your UI might be very different. If you can't drag and drop things, then you may need to have a very different type of interaction. So at that point, if you're trying to use responsive techniques to get all of that UX into a single set of assets, that's when you really hit the serious performance problem. Another case is when you have really large images, and you encounter, as I have, that the current set of techniques for displaying responsive images, that is source set attributes from the Web Technology Working Group or the picture element from the W3C, they're just not well supported enough in modern browsers, even, and certainly not in legacy browsers, that you can trust that you're going to deliver assets of a reasonable size to every platform. You might have to go ahead and use a cloud solution like Adobe Scene 7 or a build time solution like doing image resizing on your development system as part of your grunt task or your gulp task workflow. So that's something to consider if you have a gallery site or a site that's focused on high resolution images. And lastly, there is just a general sense that your information architecture might need to be different for different use cases. This is one of those cases where you might think, well, this is really part of responsive, right? It's changing the navigation hierarchy, responding at runtime. And I would absolutely concur. As Dane said, we are not here to say responsive won't work. We're here to say, have a closer understanding of what it is. Responsive design might stipulate, yeah, you can change the navigation hierarchy to respond to the user's needs. Responsive development right now doesn't have a good way in the browsers to do that. It's not a good way to modify the display of trees. You can have a separate nav, but then you're stuffing your website full of extra HTML. So go ahead and do user agent detection. Go ahead and present a different HTML hierarchy. Go ahead and, if you are presenting a website for the Department of Motor Vehicles, have a different menu system for the mobile phone. They're probably on your site when they're standing in line. Give them different options. So those are just some good rules of thumb for when predictive development works better. And we've all seen websites for which responsive certainly would never work. This is Confluence. Who's used mobile Confluence? I haven't. I don't think it exists. I mean, you know, it probably exists, but it probably works way differently because this is a very interaction-heavy system. There's really no way to model it otherwise. And so trying to make a style sheet change that would make this modal a little stack, it's not going to work so well, really, for a person trying to use the site. So Dane, what have we kind of come up with in terms of the approach we take to development as a whole?
So, we believe that there can be a balance and a harmony between the different development approaches. So we firmly believe in Brad Frost and Luke Robolewski and others' statements about striving toward designing and building future-friendly online experiences. But even their meta techniques like responsive development, which embrace this idealized one-size-fits-all approach, and the use of a handful of development tools to get there, those may not be sufficient for an unpredictable future. So we must stay open. A purpose-driven web philosophy uses multiple schools of thought that each may have merit and each deserve a seat at the table when starting to discuss a project's purpose and goals in order to be able to provide a best fit experience to the end user.
You might notice that the background of this slide looks like a Renaissance painting. That's because it is a Renaissance painting. It is a famous one called the School of Athens. And it's a great metaphorical representation of what we're talking about. There in the center is sort of the two preeminent figures of ancient Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. And on the left, Plato is gesturing to the heavens to indicate, again, that ideal concepts, immaterial concepts, are the important things to reason about. And to his right is an old student of his and a good friend throughout life, despite their bitter disputes in the area of ideas, Aristotle. Might have heard him too. Aristotle is famous for having a sort of an empirical approach where you observe and you make conclusions. Now, a lot of Aristotle's conclusions were terribly wrong, but the point was his heart was in the right place, and he's gesturing to the floor. Using the somewhat flawed methodologies that he has at the present time, Aristotle is saying, pay attention to things that happen in the real world, draw conclusions about them so you can make predictions about their development. Now, what you're not seeing is that just behind the foreground bust of Plato, Diogenes the Cynic is sprawled out drunk on the staircase. But that's not the important part. The important part is to say that at the core of this extremely rich civilization that provided the foundation for a lot of our thought, there was a disagreement that was irreconcilable. So schools of thought that are directly opposed to one another can produce a thriving community and a lot of really good thought just in the way that they conflict. I think that if you take responsive design as a school of thought that has merit, but that there are reasons to oppose, then you situate it right in the set of thoughts that you have about web development in the modern age, because it's good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just best when it is opposed at times, Because as Zeno, the founder of the Stoic philosophy school, said once, all the good are friends of one another. So thank you so much for coming and for watching and for asking questions, which I know you are all about to ask in great number. And thank you, Dane, very much for helping out.
Yes, thanks, James. So yeah, I guess we can certainly open up the floor here to any questions people may have, because I think we've got a few minutes to be able to address any questions from the presentation.
We got one from Nicholas. I can't tell if that's an L or an I. Dekula. So your question is: do resolution and image size on mobile versus tablet or even desktop have to be planned so as to avoid viewers, downloaders from increasing their data usage? And that's exactly the type of thing we are trying to guard against with predictive development. You make a good point. Many around the world don't have fast internet speeds that would make this kind of question immaterial. They also may not be on unlimited data plans. So it's this exact type of thing. Now, there are a couple of competing standards for how to set up a collection of URLs for different resolution of images that the browser will pick one from depending on its viewport size. One of them is called source set. One of them is the picture elements with source elements inside. These are all really promising, but none of them are reliable enough yet, especially when you consider that there is a direct correlation between how slow somebody's internet connection is and how poor their data plan is and how old and outdated of a browser they might be using. The old Android browsers are like the new IE. So it's absolutely true. You have to use anything at your disposal to make sure people aren't downloading larger images than they need. So that includes doing user agent detection, where you figure out, are you on a mobile device? Okay, take the 640 one. Don't take the 1200 one. Are you coming from? Is the latency on your request super high? Okay, deliver a progressive JPEG so that even if it never loads all the way, somebody is able to properly understand at least something about your site. So yeah, really important to do that. The question is, another question from Nick is how would you plan a good UX, in terms of scalable resolution when mirror imaging from smartphone to smart TV is engaged? And that's a really interesting question because mirroring devices is a use case that I don't think a lot of websites do consider right now. Dane, is that something you've ever gotten as part of a sort of an acceptance criterion? Like, this thing has to look good when it's mirrored onto my Apple TV?
You know what? We have not run into that yet. I mean, that's obviously certainly on the horizon, but no specific use case at this point.
Yeah, that one's really good. I would say there is a strong technical limitation factor in here, so you have to be really conservative. There's lots of different types of mirror imaging. There's mirror imaging over AirPlay. There's mirror imaging to a Chromecast, the Roku. While some standards might be emerging, I think that a lot of this stuff is super device bound. So there's some devices that just don't have the video RAM overhead to support a resolution larger than X or something else. So I'd say that if you asked me to make a recommendation, I would say you need to make sure that your mobile site is scales well to a large device, and that you stick with it, the mobile site. Displaying the desktop site may result in resolution that TVs don't have the right dot pitch to really handle elegantly. If you can, maybe use vector graphics. That certainly will help you out with anti-aliasing. But right now, I think that's pretty unexplored territory. So it's a really, really interesting, provocative question. Oh, can you show examples of predictively developed websites? Well, so I think the important thing to remember is that predictive is the term that we are giving to a family of techniques which people consider to just be not responsive. So I think that probably the most popular predictively developed website in the world is called Facebook. Facebook makes hardly any attempt to adapt its UIs to different screen size. You might notice. They have a story for the tablet. They have a story for mobile. Those are almost always native presentation. but they have entirely different UI layers that they present to those different sites. You know, and I think that's true of pretty much any large interaction-heavy site. You know, Twitter is the same way. Certainly, you know, a site like Tumblr is the same way. And the exception to the rule, I think, is sites like Instagram, where they are a full and complete social network, but they are fundamentally responsibly designed from the mobile experience out. I mean, Dane, can you think of a site that really does deliver separate experiences at runtime that people would be super aware of?
I mean, that's probably the most prominent in Facebook. I mean, you can sort of look at how that functions and see similar sites to it, but Facebook is kind of the ultimate.
Yeah, Amazon.com too. I mean, you know, that's sort of e-commerce. We do that at Mozu, and e-commerce can be an interesting sort of blend of document-based content presentation. Here's our catalog, and then very interaction-heavy, complex workflow. Provision yourself a product. Configure yourself product. I mean, add it to a cart. Give us all your information. Check out. Amazon does not try to coax the same experience into working across multiple devices there. So, you know, this is really just stuff that people already do that we should consider a really first-class development technique rather than a set of concessions you have to make. What else we got? How important is wireframing?
We've got another question. I am a designer and wanted to know how important is wireframing on each device size. And that's an interesting question. I guess it does depend on what technique you choose and the level of complexity that you're dealing with. Because often at Brand Labs, we design and wireframe some of the main sections of the site, but then we also design what we call a style tile that allows us to show our clients, our customers, generally what the overall look and feel is going to be without having to wireframe each and every piece. But, you know, if you do have specific pages that have specific functionality that the client is going to be interested to see how that breaks down per device, you know, it's really on a per case basis. But, you know, I do hear you that you can get tons of wireframes going on. You need to figure out a way to be able to develop some sort of a style tile to be able to show how the pages will break down depending on what kind of information is being shown.
We are running a little bit short on time, so I think if nobody has any other sort of burning questions, you can save them and then send them to us later, because we're going to put these slides online. We are going to be communicating on the on blog posts and on Twitter, where you can find both Dane and I. And you know, this is an ongoing conversation that we would really love you to participate in. All right. Well, then, thank you very much, guys. Thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you again soon, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.